Hello and welcome to another set of video notes here talking about topic 1.1, and today this section is going to go over the cell theory and the characteristics of a living thing and how we would apply those characteristics in example questions that could show up on a test.
You shall not pass!
So today we're going to be covering some various understandings and some skills. We'll be looking at 1.1 U1 and of course U2. We're looking at the cell theory and the functions of what a living thing is going to be. And then for our skills, we'll be looking at how we question whether or not the cell theory really can apply to all these different types of life that exists, and then how we can take the living things, the characteristics of the living thing, and how we can apply them to a specific example of a living thing and show that it must be living. So we talk about the cell theory. The cell theory is this idea of what cells are, and it basically comprises of three concepts that up to this point we haven't found many examples of things that necessarily go against all of the cell theory. There might be some parts that kind of make us question whether or not the cell theory is the best wording for how we can explain what a cell is and how cells relate to living things. But those three parts would be, first off, that living things are made from cells, and so everything that is considered to be alive must be made of cells. It could be a single-celled organism, it could be a multicellular organism, but the smallest part of a living thing, therefore, is going to be the cell. So that means that of life, the smallest unit of life must be cells. So since all living things are made of cells, and the smallest living thing could be a single cell, the unit of life, or the smallest unit of a living thing, would be a cell. Once you start getting into the parts of a cell, the things that make up a cell, even though they are parts of the cell, they're no longer considered to be a living thing. Just like if we were to look at, an organism, we have all these different systems. You have a brain, you have a heart, you have a liver, you have a stomach, and those are parts of you, but they by themselves are not a full organism, not a full human being. They're just the parts that make up that thing. And then the last part is that cells must come from pre-existing cells. And this one gets a little complicated because you're probably immediately, once you hear that, you're starting to wonder, well, wait a minute, if all cells come from pre-existing cells, where did the first cells come from? And that's what we will talk about in 1.5. We'll talk about the theories behind how cells probably came into existence. But the established theory now, the established way that it works into the way we see life now, is that regardless of where cells originated from, the cells that you're made out of, the cells that the plants around you are made out of, all came from a cell that existed before them. And so all current cells are coming from some pre-existing cell that already existed. So when we think about this, we talk about, for example, that all living things are made of cells. This has been tested a few times over hundreds of years. We've had scientists basically collect samples from lots of different animals, lots of different plants, lots of different types of what we would be considered alive or living thing, and all of those samples would be comprised of multiple groups of cells living together, or fused together as like a tissue layer. Or if we're looking at single cells that might function independently entirely as just one cell by itself, like a paramecium or an amoeba, even though they are individual cells, being a living thing, they're still made of at least one cell. So these first two components, that all living things are made out of cells, and then that the smallest part of what a living thing would be is a cell, are really closely related to each other. So for example, here, if we're looking at a paramecium, there are a lot of complex structures inside this paramecium. Here we have some contracting vacuoles, which can be used to push water in and out of the cell in order to help with the exchange of nutrients and waste material. Here we have some probably container of chlorophyll. So it's a chloroplast there, and so that chlorophyll there is going to help with the process of photosynthesis. inside, possibly here. It's kind of not really easy to see in this image. There could be a nucleus, or maybe it's under that box there. And then we can also see small little storage vacuoles, these small little vesicles, that are storing so maybe some material inside the paramecium. So all these individual parts of the paramecium, they help the paramecium to stay alive, they help it do different functions, but those individual parts themselves are not a living part. So if I were to remove, for example, the chloroplast here from the paramecium, it would not be able to survive by itself. So it itself is not a living thing because it would not have all the characteristics of a living thing, which is what we'll get to in a minute. So even though there are what we call these organelles that make up the structures of cells, just like you have organs that keep your body alive, the structures inside cells that keep cells alive are called organelles, and the E-L-L-E-S there, that means like very tiny, so it just means tiny organs, right? They themselves cannot survive outside of the cell. So the smallest living thing that can exist is a cell. And then the last one, the idea that all cells come from pre-existing cells. So cells can multiply by simply just going through the process of division. There's really simple division like binary fission, which is what bacteria do, or there's more complex division like mitosis, or even the formation of sex cells through meiosis, which we'll all talk about in different units over the course of the year. So this probably means that all life must be deriving from some type of similar ancestor, because that living thing must have come from an earlier living thing, which came from an earlier living thing. And so if we trace all of these lineages back in time, we'll eventually find the originating point of where the first cells were first created. Because of things like mitosis and meiosis, we can generate a lot of variation through sexual reproduction. But if we don't want variation, with meiosis we can produce genetic variation, but if we do not want genetic variation, if we want clones of things, we would be doing that through mitosis, which we will talk about later in this unit as well. And so mitosis is when we create genetic identical copies of cells. And so when you fall down and you hurt your knee, you have to repair the tissue that you've damaged, and so you want all of the tissue cells that are made to fix the part of your body to be identical to the ones around them, so that you don't accidentally grow a bone on the outside of your body, or instead of muscle tissue end up with nervous tissue or lung tissue. So through the process of mitosis, we can produce genetically identical cells or copies of these cells. And so it's really quite easy for multiple cells of the exact same type to be produced in high volume, which is how we can get a multicellular organism to be functioning and staying alive, even though all of those individual cells are all living individual living cells in some ways. They're all working together. They're all genetically very similar to each other because they're all based around the DNA that made you or made that organism. Okay, and so if we want to create variation in complex organisms, that's when we would use meiosis. But meiosis is still another way for reproduction to occur, for cells to be made by other cells. And so during meiosis, we will form what we call gametes, or the sex cells, like a sperm cell and the egg cell. And in complex organisms, a single sperm cell and a single egg cell will fuse together, and from that new diploid cell is where a full organism eventually will grow into trillions of cells that make up a person, or some other type of complex organism. So these, in general, these are just the cell theory, the three main parts of the cell theory. So it's important that you understand these three parts. And as we go through the rest of topic 1, you're going to see where we get a lot of evidence for these three core ideas. Now, even though most of the living things out there really kind of follow this set example of what we think a cell should be and what a part of a living thing is going to be like, there are some examples of what we call these atypical examples. All right, they don't necessarily quite fit the cell theory because there's something about them that it goes a little bit against what we would imagine a cell to be like. They don't necessarily go against the cell theory, but they're not a typical cell the way that they're structured. And so one example that you need to know about is actually right there inside of your body. It's your striated muscles, the muscles that you are controlling when you are, moving different parts of your body. And so striated muscle cells challenges this idea that cells have a single nucleus. And so striated muscle cells are actually really long fibers bound together, and in those fibers we have what we call multinucleated muscle cells. And so muscle cells actually have multiple nucleuses, so that they have multiple copies of the DNA, so that the DNA, there's enough DNA present so that they can make all of the copies of the proteins needed in order to make these strong actin myosin fibers, which are these strong protein fibers that control the size of the muscle cells. And so when you are contracting your muscles, you're making your muscle cells smaller, and by doing that, they are pulling on your structural system, your bones, which are changing the shape of your hand position or the shape of your body. And so in order to do these complex motions which contract and relax or change the shape of your muscle cells, you need all these really these billions and billions of these muscle fiber proteins called actin and myosin. And so in order to produce all of them and keep them all functioning, you need many copies of the DNA inside of a single cell. And so you need multiple nucleuses in order for this to occur. So a muscle fiber are really quite long. They can be, you can see them with the naked eye, but if we really want to see the nucleus and the individual parts of the cell, we're going to have to use a microscope. But I mean, an individual muscle fiber could be quite long, about 300 millimeters long. And so in order to keep such a long, complex structure all working together and all regulated properly, it's going to be multinucleated. So as the fiber increases in size, rather than do what you'd expect most cells to do, which would be to divide, therefore increasing the surface area and decreasing the volume to maintain that high surface area to volume ratio. It gets through the whole process of doing cellular division, but then it doesn't actually divide the membrane. So it's one single large cell membrane or plasma membrane around all these multiple copies of the nucleus that were created. So in order to get over the surface area to volume ratio issue that we've already talked about, one way to combat this is to have muscle fibers be very, 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 very thin. So they have a relatively large surface area by being very, very long, but they have a very small volume by being very, very thin. And so your nervous system also does this as well. Your nerve cells are incredibly long, but also very, very thin. That's how they're able to maintain homeostasis. So this kind of works against this idea that we have in biology that cells are very, very small and microscopic. And so here muscle fibers, even though you can't see the individual parts without a microscope, you can see the fibers themselves without a microscope, so they are quite visible. And they have multiple nucleuses where we would normally think that a cell would have a single nucleus. So here's just one example of an atypical organism or type of cell that goes against what we understand for our cell theory. And so like the muscle cells in animals, in plants, or not plants, sorry, fungi. Fungi are not plants, don't get them confused, sorry. In fungi, we also see another example of something where we have multinucleation occur. And so this aseptated fungal hyphae, or basically, again, challenges this idea of a cell being a single unit. Rather than having kind of a root system or a fungal body system that's made up of a bunch of small cells, like you see here, here's a bunch of repeating sections of cell. The hyphae are one giant cell with multiple nucleus, just like we saw with our muscle cells. And so by having one giant system, the fungi is a little bit easier for them to regulate their growth and the direction of their growth and regulate and adapt to certain changes in their environment, which is good for them. And so by being very, very large and containing lots of nuclei, they kind of go against, just like we said before, this idea of cells being very, very small and them not having a single nucleus, where the fungi hyphae here can be multinucleated and extend outwards and have a very long continuous cytoplasm, which allows them to move material around inside of themselves very, very quickly without having to go through multiple cell walls and cell membranes, and which would slow down the transport of material. So again, just another atypical example. And in kind of like the plant community, we have the giant algae, or what the giant algae looks like. So you can see the image there. And so that looks like it would be a multicellular complex living organism. But the thing that's unique about the giant algae is that they're actually single-celled organisms, and they really challenge this idea that single-cell organisms have to be very, very small, and that they have very simple structures, which the giant algae kind of goes against that. And we do mean it's really big in size, from 5 to 100 millimeters, so it's very easy for you to see them without a microscope. But they are, in fact, a single cell that has complex anatomical parts. So normally, if we want to have very specific parts that do different functions, you have to have multiple cells that are designed to do those specific functions. Where here the giant algae can have different parts that do different functions, but they're all made of just one continuous membrane that's been adapted in different areas to do those different functions. So we've got a bottom section here, the rhizoid, which is kind of like like a makeshift root system, right? That kind of helps anchor the algae in to the lower part. It's got a very long stalk here, which again, it's all one continuous membrane with all these little extensions as well, which help stabilize the long stalk. And then up above, you have this really large umbrella-like structure, which helps fan out the algae so that it can increase the surface area to do photosynthesis. And so this algae, having these three distinct parts that all do different jobs, and they're all designed to do those specific jobs, but they're all, again, all a single cell, a single continuous membrane. And so we've got these complex abilities, these complex structures, but a single cell. So that really challenges this idea that if you're going to have something that's complicated in structure, it has to be made from thousands to millions of cells working together. So now that we've discussed the cell theory, we talked about some examples that might not necessarily go exactly with the cell theory, the way we understand it, the way we understand cells to be. We still, though, because they are all cells, they do match the cell theory of the idea that they are living things and they are the smallest living thing. And so you need to make sure that you understand, what does that mean, living thing? How do we know something is a living thing? Why is it that a rock is not a living thing, or a virus is not really a living thing, versus something like an animal cell or a plant cell? So you've probably already heard of movement, reproduction, sensitivity, homeostasis, maybe not homeostasis in earlier classes, growth, respiration, it's like cellular respiration, excretion, and nutrition. Or you might have heard it as Mrs. Gren, or here if we add in homeostasis, it is Mrs. H. Gren, like a full hyphen name there. So you've probably heard of these as our characteristics of living things, and they do work in this level of biology, but there are some other ways that we can discuss these characteristics, or look at them more in terms of functions. So these are all characteristics. Movement is a characteristic, reproduction is a characteristic, sensitivity is a characteristic, but how does that relate to the function of an actual living thing? So we might want to think about it more as in terms of homeostasis, respiration, nutrition. These things can all be connected towards something like metabolism, right? The ability to do chemical reactions, all right, for you to change the chemistry inside of you or the environment around you in order to stay alive. So that would be metabolism, right? Or response, so sensitivity, right, and homeostasis as well can and movement can also be grouped together with the idea to be able to respond to the living environment around you, to other living things interacting with you, and other features of your environment, move towards light, move away from heat, things like that. Homeostasis, again, homeostasis is just a really great biological word, because homeostasis is this idea of maintaining a steady point or a happy, healthy condition, right? Cell size is an influence of homeostasis, so cells try to maintain their homeostasis by keeping themselves small by doing cellular division. Homeostasis would be like regulating the amount of water or the pH inside of the cell in order to keep it alive and healthy. Growth, again, growth in terms of the function, is very similar to what we talked about as its characteristics. All living things are going to grow in size. Even if you're a bacterial cell, you still grow in size until eventually you do binary fission and then divide yourself in half and become a smaller bacterial cell because you just did reproduction. But all cells, all living things will go through some type of growth and normally change and develop themselves in some way. Excretion, very similar to the one as well. This idea of removing waste material, we have to get rid of waste material because it is toxic to living things, and so we have to get them out of the cells or out of the organism. Reproduction, all living things die, so of course we have to have reproduction for life to continue. So all living things in some form or another are going to be designed and want to go through the process of reproduction, either sexually or asexually, so that their DNA and their genetic information is carried on to the next generation. And then of course, nutrition as well. Everything requires organic material as a source of nutrition, as a way to make energy or produce or transfer energy from radiant energy to chemical energy, and so at some point that chemical energy has to do some kinetic movement or some type of other chemical response. And also with nutrition, we have to build material from other materials. If you are made out of sugars and fats and proteins, and of course if you're going to increase in the number of cells inside of your body, if you're going to increase in size, you're going to need more sugar and more fats and more protein in order to build those parts of you. It's like, if you're going to build a house out of Legos, you need more Legos in order to make a bigger house. So you're going to need nutrition. You need to take in that nutrition to use as a source of energy, but also as a way to have more building material to make a larger you. So it's important that you understand both the characteristics of a living thing and then how things like metabolism, response, homeostasis, growth, excretion, reproduction, and nutrition also can be related to the function that are keeping a living thing alive. So you can think of Mrs. H. Gren or Mr. H. Gren is another way you can think of it in terms of its functions. Sorry, this one's just reminding you that if you want to remember metabolism, response, homeostasis, growth, reproduction, excretion, nutrition, you can remember Mr. H. Gren versus Mrs. S. Gren. Okay, so what I want you to do now, so here we got a paramecium here, and paramecium is just a single-celled complex organism, complex cell like a eukaryote. And what I want you to do is, how do we see the functions of life in this paramecium? So if you don't really know much about a paramecium, you can pause the video and just go do a little bit of reading about it. But what I want you to think is just using Mr. H. Gren, where do we see the functions of life inside of a paramecium? All right, so you pause the video, you tried practicing this idea. Okay, so then let's think about it. So with metabolism, there are metabolic pathways inside the cytoplasm of the paramecium. The paramecium is going to have enzymes inside that help it do chemistry to build things and to break things down, so it itself would have a metabolism. If we talk about the response, on the outside of the paramecium there's a bunch of little cilia. They're very difficult to see, but they're little tiny hairs sticking out. You can see this one a little bit easier there. And so the paramecium has these little cilia to help them move around their environment. And so if they need to move towards a source of food or a source of better pH or better temperatures, they are able to respond using the cilia. So changes in the environment allow them to respond. In terms of homeostasis, we have contracting vacuoles that are present to allow the paramecium to take in more water or release water in order to balance, how much water is present inside of the cell. If it's increasing too much in size, it can release the water. If there's not enough water present to do chemical reactions, it can contract and try to absorb more water into the cell. In terms of growth, the paramecium would increase in size, and eventually it would do binary fission. It would divide in half and go through the process of division. There as well, it would go through, sorry, not binary division, go through mitosis because it's a eukaryotic cell. It would go through mitosis, just like any other eukaryotic cell. When it goes through reproduction, again, going through the process of cell division by mitosis, it's therefore reproducing asexually. Excretion, the plasma membrane there can allow it to excrete or release waste material out of the cell through exocytosis. And in terms of nutrition, so inside here we have little food vacuoles, which are basically food particles or waste material that maybe were absorbed by the paramecium. And so as it absorbed it, it's going to be digesting it and breaking it down in order to use it as a source of energy, and also as building materials so that the paramecium can continue to grow and possibly eventually go through mitosis again and do more asexual reproduction. So this is a skill that you should have leading up for something like your tests, right? You might not have to do all of Mr. H. Gren on a test. You wouldn't do all of them, but any one of them could be used as a question where they give you an example of an organism, and then you need to state what functions you can identify in that organism and how they relate to it being a living thing. Okay, so then let's do another practice. Maybe we're just looking at an animal cell. The parameciums are considered animals, so we'll look at a plant cell like an algae that does photosynthesis and things like that. So here we have an algae. Stop the video, and you can go through the process of, again, do some research on it if you don't know much about it, and then try to think, how can I identify and add information to this image about, from this image about these functions. Okay, so you did it. Okay, go through Mr. H. Gren. So again, metabolism, metabolic pathways in the cytoplasm. All cells have metabolic pathways present in the cytoplasm. Response, we can see cilia again on the outside of the algae, which allows it to move around its environment. Homeostasis, it also has some contracting vacuoles which allow the movement of water in and out of the cell in order to help, maintain its size. There's a lot of things that you could use as an example of homeostasis. That's not the only one. Growth, here we actually can see it going through the process of binary fission. Being a simple organism, it's going to be dividing in half right here. In terms of binary fission, again, I said it's mitosis, not binary fission. Going through the process of mitosis, here it actually looks like it's going through the process of mitosis. Looks like it's splitting right here as it starts to divide. Okay. In terms of excretion, there's a plasma membrane which would control what goes in and out of the cell, so it can excrete or release any waste material through the plasma membrane. And in terms of nutrition, we can also see here the chlorophyll present inside the chloroplasts, which would allow it to do photosynthesis. Doing photosynthesis allows it to produce, using CO2 and water and light energy, create things like sugars and fats and proteins, so it can build its own nutrition rather than having to consume something. Okay, so that's it for this video. Hopefully you understand it. If not, you can go back and rewatch some things, or ask me some questions in class.